interesting panel today. East meets West, as you can see, is very balanced. One from China, one from Israel, one from Germany, and one from Singapore. Actually, it's not actually Singaporean, it's actually Malaysian. But it's okay, I'm the Singaporean one. Okay, so I think the topic today is East meets West. It's not exactly the easiest topic to talk about, but we have actually an interesting panel. So let's say start with maybe from China. He's from ZTE. As we all know, ZTE is one of the biggest conglomerate in China, and they have expanded quite globally. I think Jenik, right? I think he's actually dealing with security, and he's actually very interesting. From Israel, he's actually starting to actually looking at companies in Korea. That's actually very, very brave, right? If you don't know anything, just move to that country and find out more about that country, right? And on the other side of the sofa, we have got someone who is actually basically a German who is setting up an incubator for FinTech in Singapore. And he thinks that Singapore is the best place to be for FinTech. Then we're going to find out about that as well. And the last person down there, not least, is Jeffrey. He's, as a declaration, actually, Patsnap is actually one of my investee company. They have expanded really well and made me really happy. They've started with two-man company, and now they are about 150 or 160 man company, and they're also doing reasonably well, I think. Maybe you start with ZTE, and maybe I think the first question I'll ask is, as a global company or as a startup company, tell us about the cultural difficulties you face when you're actually looking at expanding globally.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is Tong from ZTE Corporation, and very happy to have the chance to share our experience of ZTE's process of globalization. And you may all know that ZTE is already a global operating company, that our products have been sold to more than 160 countries and areas, that we have more than 100 overseas branches. And our income, the annual revenues, are also globalized. More than 60 are from the overseas markets. And we have our four overseas branches hire more than 60% of the employees from the local experts and talents. We didn't send too much employees from China. So just now, Edmund asked me that if we have some cultural problems. I have to say yes, it do exist. But generally speaking, here, considering my background, I would like to say something more about the IP issues, if Edmund agreed that. All the ZTE management have a common acknowledgement saying that behind our globalization, the IP plays a very important role to support our commercial strategy. Okay. And everybody knows that the telecommunication industry is really a high-tech industry. And when ZTE decided to move into the global market, you can find that all the patents or more important technologies, standards are owned by the Western companies. For example, Nokia, Motorola, Ericsson, so on. And they would like to use IP, and they do not dare to use IP as a weapon to attack the new competitors. So when we realized that there is a potential risk to ZTE and other Chinese companies, we decided to invest more and more into our technology and R&D. We needed to build our own
Maybe at this juncture, maybe I switch the question over to Jeffrey. Since you're talking about IP, and basically I think asking the challenge of actually expanding the company beyond Singapore.
Just to share a bit context, so Patsnap started in Singapore, then we grew to China in 2009, and then we set up our London office in 2012. So from our own experience, I think the biggest challenge will be culture. Like we have on board a German CTO. Working with German is very different with working with Chinese.
Really?
After working with him, I appreciate German engineering quality. Everything is systematic. Everything is make sure the quality is good. Sometimes, I mean, it's an over-generalization, but Chinese, the way we do things, I'm part of Chinese as well, but they will not think as far ahead. So it's a big cultural clash when our German technical director with our Chinese work together. It took a few years for us to sort of come to the middle ground, a compromise. So culture is a big thing, I will say, for challenge.
And any response from a
glad to hear my
German what I call national?
Well, I'm glad to hear my German fellows do prove the quality. No, I mean, yeah, I guess for us coming the other way around, we are a startup ourselves from London, coming to Singapore now, doing startup bootcamp in London and other places in Europe. Coming out to Singapore to run an accelerator for fintech startups here was probably the other way around, to see how we can adjust our acceleration model from London to the Asian market and Singapore market in particular. And we have similar cultural, interesting conversations going on. How to run an accelerator in London is very different how to run one in Asia. You have to see how you can actually adjust it to startups in Asia that have different needs. Yeah, but it's good.
So Aviram, any maybe thoughts about what do you think about the cultural difference between Israel companies and Korean companies since you are there and you took the plunge, and what do you feel about Israeli technology within Korea?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think there's a cultural problem at all. I think that's an excuse by Asian companies on why they don't succeed. So I grew up in Israel. I lived in Silicon Valley for the last 10 years, and I spent half of my time in recent years in Korea. So I get to see the Israeli, the American, and the Korean startup life. And yeah, of course, there's cultural differences. There's cultural differences between people in Singapore. Two people in Singapore will have cultural differences. There's ones between Northern Chinese and Southern Chinese. That's never a good excuse for. It's a global country. It's a global world. I mean, and you go to Silicon Valley. There's people from all races, colors, languages. They're all together, and then they all go to IPO on Nasdaq. So. I don't think, and one good example is ZTE here. I mean, yeah, there's a cultural difference between ZTE and let's say Apple, okay? And yet ZTE is doing really, really, really well.
Oh, thanks.
So I think there's a cultural difference, and we can discuss it, but I don't think it matters, really. I mean, Israelis do really well in California, and you've heard that from many, many speakers before me. And there's the culture in Israel is different than the American culture, different by a lot. Like we're very impolite, just as an example. And so we go to California, we learn to be a little more polite, and we use our impoliteness to do good things, for example. So a cultural difference is another element you have in you, and I think it's a way for a startup to find its right way to move forward. It's not a barrier for anything.
Okay, so I suppose the takeaway is just do it, right? So just go to the country that you're not familiar with and just learn about as you go along, right? I suppose the next following on question will be, how do you scale a business? Like the key question now here is how you scale a business. When you are starting up from zero base, I think other than ZTE, I think the three other panelists actually started from nothing. So everyone has actually gone over from Singapore to the east, to the west, and there's two of you who actually went from the east or the west to the east. So how do you kind of change your mindset, and what do you think of companies what kind of qualities do you think that companies must have to actually enable that to happen? Maybe start with
I just want to maybe shift the focus to fintech startups. So
Yep.
that's away from us. I mean, by the way, we are an accelerator for fintech startups, so we accelerate fintech businesses. So we are helping fintech startups in Singapore and London to grow. And looking at startups from Asia, for example, if they want to grow into West, if you're a B2B business, you know your customer, you know your pain points. It doesn't matter if you're in Singapore, in Sydney, in London, or New York. So I really recommend every fintech startup that want to scale anywhere, East, West, is to know your customers and know the community in the niche you're working in. If you're doing capital markets or trade finance, you have exactly the same pain points here in Asia than there are in London or New York. So really moving along this niche, I think, can help to really have a product that fits into this niche. It's easier to scale than if you go broadly B2C, for example. And that's what we see with fintech. Works very well, because that's why also startups coming from the States now to Singapore, because it's the same customers, the same environment, and just do it.
But don't you find that a lot of companies, when they just started out, the first question you ask them about scalability, the common answer will be, I'm addressing my local market first, right? So is that something that's valid? Because you went to Korea, so
it's horrible.
You hear that in Korea.
It's absolutely horrible. I mean, the only advantage Singapore has compared to the other Asian countries is the market is a little small, so it might not be tempting to go after the domestic market. But going after the domestic market that for me is a turn off. So if I talk to a startup and they use this line on me, I'm done with the startup. And this is probably why Israeli startups are so successful. Is we're never going to think about the local market because it's so small. I don't know what Chinese startups will do. It'll be interesting because the market is really big. But think of any Asian country, the market is never big enough for a company to be big, right? So, and then your global, whoever is doing it globally will come in and kill you. And that happened again and again. There's countless of examples of local startups that were really good, really popular. Then, like a Google or Facebook comes in and kills them. You can't do it the other way around. You have to start global. The way to start global is to give up your domestic market. It's a trap. It's literally a trap. So hopefully that doesn't happen much in Singapore. I mean, I'm sure Markus tells the startups to focus on the global and whatever you do, think global. Yeah, but yeah, addressing the local market, that's your way to die in the future. You'll either not be successful enough to survive, or you'll be just successful enough to not scale, or you'll be really successful and then somebody will come out and kill you from the outside. Those are the three options.
And the same question to Jeffrey, why did you, from the start, you actually trying to actually go overseas rather than actually focus in the local market?
Yeah, I agree with Markus and Aviram. I think just look back at the past 6-7 years, those started around the same time as mine. Those who focus on the local market, usually website that end with .sg, usually doesn't survive quite well. And from day one for us and among our peers that who survive are usually the market from day one is outside, or the cost structure, the cost center is outside. So that I would say back then for Patsnap is sort of not by choice, also by circumstances, that we knew that if we continue to just stay in Singapore, just try to do Singapore market, not even to do Singapore market, but back then we don't even have enough funding to fund our project in Singapore, cannot find investor back then. So based on that, we just think that, hey, why not just explore outside of Singapore and just give it a try, and so far it works for us.
For ZT, I suppose you got no choice. A lot of actually Chinese company actually don't expand globally because I think the Chinese market is huge. So why do you think that you need to actually expand into other countries, whereas China, your backyard is huge market? Right?
Well, although I haven't joined ZT at the first stage when they decided to go abroad, but when we look back at our company history, I think I can tell you something about why we make the decision. At that time, in the Chinese telecommunication market, it's occupied completely by the foreign companies. That is what they just mentioned, that if you cannot survive in the domestic market, you need to find some way to go abroad. That is the same as yesterday, the minister said that we go abroad is not for innovation, it's for the survival. We need to find some market. If we cannot find it in China, we need to go outside. And that is what I want to continue for the IP issues, saying that when you go abroad, you need to evaluate the risks. It's not only about the products, the potential market, your potential clients, but you have to see, once you decide to move into a new country, you should think about first, will suffer some legal risks there. So ZT's way at that time is first to move to some underdevelopment markets. We started from Asia. And then when we get stronger, we tried to move to Europe, to US. And you can witness the same thing nowadays in China still happens. For example, Xiaomi. Xiaomi does quite well in the Chinese mobile market, quite well, but their patent portfolio is not strong enough. So they still wait to best time to go abroad. So I think risk should always be considered.
Yeah, actually there's an interesting question, right? Continuing from Aviram's point about local versus a global market as a trap. How do you reconcile that dilemma between what I call being a local company and a global company? And is there any golden rule that you actually use as what I call a ruler to measure against? Sounds like someone wants a solution how to grow a company.
Oh yeah, that's a really easy question to answer. I think there's no dilemma. You only go global. So the golden rule is if you've acquired too many customers in your local market, you got to stop.
Yep.
And to a point where so if I go to a company that's successful in the local market and if I'm not turned off, like I said before, I tell them, okay, you're gonna stop answering. If somebody calls you, you hang up. If somebody sends you PO, you reject it. You focus on the global market to not go in the trap. I think Singapore doesn't have this problem, but other Asian countries have the problem of language. You got to realize. So in Israel, we speak Hebrew. That's our language. No Israeli entrepreneur in the history of the world, I think, in Israel, ever wrote a website in Hebrew. Never. We'd never think that. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we do that? So if you're in an Asian country,
but the Israeli market is really small, right? So
well, that's the reason.
That's why you write Hebrew.
So the first trap is putting it in your local language. Yeah. That's the first trap. You got to start in English. You got to start as a global country. And if you service local customers, you must not localize until you've globalized, and then you go back, and then you come back to your local.
But don't you think that you have to validate some assumptions first for the local market? You can't just assume you're going to test US, China, and India at the same time. You validate 2 or 3 MVPs in Singapore, and then obviously have the global vision, but be a bit global at the beginning. Be a bit local at the beginning, and then go global. Obviously, as the next step.
I think so. No. And I'll explain why. First of all, in 2015, it's as easy to have a contract with a company in California than in Singapore, if you're a Singaporean country.
Sure. It's
really easy. There's no, so local doesn't really mean anything, local market. And the second thing is, this is for experts. So if you're really good, validate it with your local market. But if you're like a first-time entrepreneur, you're going to fall into the trap. I guarantee you. You'll do something that's very Singaporean, and all your Singaporean customers will give you the heads up. Or worse, in China, they'll have you navigate into the Chinese way of doing things, and then you go out and you're stuck.
So I guess you mean more the mindset. Is this something you're referring to?
Correct.
Okay, right.
So that is for experts.
If you're looking into payments or any kind of fintech again, but we say really just do it well at home, but have already obviously the scalability in the product, in the team, in the legals, and the IP to scale up.
Well, but the problem is, so what happens if you develop something for a Singapore bank, and they ask you to support some kind of payment system, which they think is critical, but only they use it because it's a Singaporean thing. You'll never know it. So you're going to be spending time and effort in doing, or they're going to tell you it's not good enough because XYZ, and that XYZ is a Singapore thing, then that's the wrong kind of feedback. You should ask the Bank of America. You should ask HSBC, because they're global,
yeah, sure.
Okay?
Yeah. But DBS at the same time also has a lot of regional coverage. But I guess, it really depends how you define it. But I think it's important to validate first at some customers and then take it from there.
Maybe.
Actually, I have a question for Aviram. So I agree that we should go global from day one, but is the physical present, is it very important? Let's say, sure, I can sign up a client from California, but do I or my team have to be in California to really get all this validation, or can we do it remotely with nowadays technology?
That's a beautiful question. So the trap one of the traps Asian countries have is this personal thing, which is very, very important in Asia, but very not important in California. So I live in California, and I have customer calls sometimes, and it could be a customer across the street, and we're going to do it on a WebEx. So we'll get on the phone, we're doing a WebEx. I can cross the street and meet them, but they're not going to ask me. Nobody is going to ask me. So physical presence in 2015 means, time flies. So no, I think it's not important at all. I think there's no problem. You can call someone from Apple, you can call someone from, and maybe they happen to be in Singapore, and then you can meet them for coffee, great. But you can call them up and they'll be in California. So I think physical presence is very overrated. Be where it's easy for you, because you can find programmers and you like it, and maybe you can get funding. Funding is important because it's a personal thing. You got to talk to investors. But business, no.
I think that's a great line of thought processes, because as far as an investor is concerned, most investors like a company that has a local development team, but they actually have what I call a mindset to expand or scale a lot faster. Right? So I think that the whole gist of the whole point is that it doesn't matter where you are, as long as you actually have a potential to scale beyond your own regional shores or national shores, that'd be a great what I call value for investment potential, right? Touching on the various areas where you guys are coming from, I think cutting across all this is actually basically between ZTE and Patsnap actually is intellectual property. So as far as your what I call your even startup bootcamp or your investments or what I call Accelerator is concerned and your involvement in Korea, how important is intellectual property as far as you guys are concerned for the companies that you are actually looking after? Maybe start up with ZTE. How important is IP for ZTE when you are actually scaling out of China, out of your comfort zone? Although last year, is it last year or year before, China has filed the most IP? But whether it's relevant or not, we still do not know, right? Whether the IP is relevant, right? So it's kind of touchy question.
Well,
answer.
I think it's my third time to mention IP today. Maybe, considering the company's nature and the industry where we lies, IP is the most important thing to us. Our management and our CEO has pointed out many times in different events. I can tell you some of the figures that nowadays, according to the WIPO's data, ZTE ranks the top 2 IPC patent applicant and the holder. Globally, our patent portfolio is around 60,000 patents, and around 17,000 is get authorized. And we are the member of more than 60 standard organizations. We're making more than 28,000 standard proposals. And a great part of them has been adopted by the SSOs and become the so-called SEPs. That is so-called standard essential patents. That is something that in the standard that cannot be avoided to use. So to take 4G technology as an example, ZTE owns more than 800 patents. That is about 13% of the whole standard. So IP is really important for us because it gives us a power to defend from those competitors, like Ericsson. Sorry, I cannot mention too many companies' names.
We are all friends. We're all friends of yours.
Oh, yeah. And anyway, it is a public news. You can find it in the internet.
Maybe at least Jerry can tell us some of the interesting companies that actually file IP, a bit obscure that we do not know about, to actually show the importance of IP in any industry they are in. Share some interesting companies.
Because I'm from IP industry, of course, I have a bias towards IP. I think IP is very important. In fact, just last few months, we have a hospital that signed up for our software. Hospital also has a lot of innovation coming out from their doctors, from their nurses. We also sign up like a bank in US. So bank also have a lot of algorithm, trading algorithm, like they need IP to protect them. So from our experience, any industry that involved in any form of R&D or innovation, they will need some form of IP to protect the idea, especially increasingly this globalized competition. That is our view on that.
Because there's so many startups here in the room, I hope. Within FinTech, IP is important, obviously, but more important is compliance and regulations. So if you want to scale a FinTech startup, you care a bit about IP, obviously, everyone does, but it's more important to look into compliance and regulations. And this is probably more of a, like, you should look at the expanding globally theme. Regulations is probably one of the biggest barriers in FinTech, at least, to actually scale globally. And IP is always there, but it's how we actually comply with the banks, infrastructure. How do you actually regulate the framework of this peer-to-peer loans, for example? That is really more important question than IP for us.
Okay.
But I agree with that because the second point of mine is that the IP issue is not only for the patent's quantity and the quality, but you need to have some experts that are familiar with the IP laws in different countries. The US and European, China, Korea, Japan, the laws are totally different. You should to get familiar with them, otherwise you will lose the litigation.
I think just outside we were talking about actually hacking and basically what I call security companies. So actually IP within the security business, is it actually really important? Because you get people who are, like we're talking about East and West, and the number of people in the security business in the West rather in the East, right? So my contention was actually the East rather hack rather than actually come out with security companies. Yeah, so we're talking about that outside. Maybe you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I'm actually surprised. I was really interested to hear the answers because I guess it must be industry specific. So in the industries I know, I've never heard of a company being successful because they had IP.
Yeah.
And I don't think ZTE is successful because of IP. I think it could be a side effect or it could be a second thing that you do after you're successful. In fact, there was one interesting case in a security company, Israeli, that had IP. They had a patent on that could block everybody. So they had a patent that could block all the competition from doing something very specific. It was a very, very broad patent. And they knew they couldn't use it. It wasn't, not only it didn't scare anybody, because they all developed. I was one of the competitors. And so we all developed and we weren't worried. And they couldn't use it. They were afraid to use it because when you're a startup and you're using IP, that's the nuclear bomb. And you're gonna explode along with everybody. So ZTE knows it, so they're not gonna use it. But ZTE is threatening Samsung, which also has the nuclear bomb, so that now everybody is cooled. So it's like Russia and the US.
Yeah, Cold War. Yes.
Cold War, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's happy. But when you're a startup, you can't threaten it because you're not going to use it, and everybody knows. So I would say in my business, IP is almost meaningless. It's nice for the investors. It's a good bullet point on the slide, and that's it.
Okay, so I suppose there's a last question in the spirit of Innovfest Unbound. Maybe starting from Jeffrey. What's the advice for any company who actually want to move from a local scenario and explore expanding globally? Right? So I think each of you actually have different I think views on this.
I think so far this discussion, like what especially Aviram and Markus has mentioned, I think from day one, go global. That is my view from day one. Of course, then the next question is how to grow global. So I just have a chat with another fellow entrepreneur. I think most important for us, at least that works for us, is when we go global, set up the local office, need to be someone that share your DNA, or yourself, or your core lieutenant that share your DNA and set up the local presence there. If you hire someone external, the risk of that office not working might be high. So far, at least what we experience.
Know your customers.
Short and simple, and advice?
Well, so there's one thing that hasn't been mentioned, and I'm surprised. So the chance of success of a startup is about 5 in 100 or less, right?
Yep.
And so I've got to wait for any startup to increase that by 5 times.
Okay.
Okay? You ready? So Yossi Vardi, the chairman of this program, has a 25 success rate in startup success. So I'm surprised. There should be a line of people waiting to him to give him shares. Because having him as a shareholder, not for investment, don't ask him for money. Give him your shares. Just by having him as a shareholder in your company, now just to keep his statistics, you have a 25% chance of doing. But it's not a joke. I think the one thing Asian startups are missing is that thing of finding someone, giving him shares so that their interests align with you. Find that expert that has done it, that has been successful, and bring him into your company.
Okay. I got a proviso to that. Anybody who actually get involved in more than 10 companies don't have time. Okay, that aside because I'm moderator down here. Is that the last words?
The last word is IP will not give you direct success in the world, but without IP, the risk is you will suffer will be increased. That is my last suggestion.
Okay, I think that ends the session. Thank you very much.